Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.36 The Last Days of David. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, King David had survived a revolt led by his son Absalom. His conciliary field marshal Joab had dispatched all David's enemies, including David's own nephew. The book of 2 Samuel ends with a perplexing census. Long quote. 2 Samuel 24:1. The anger of Yahweh again flared up against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go and number Israel and Judah. The king said to Joab, his army commander, Make the rounds of all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Bathsheba, and take a census of the people. Joab answered the king, May Yahweh your God increase the number of the people 100-fold, while your own eyes see it. But why should my lord king want this? However, the king's command to Joab remained firm. Joab reported to the king the number of the people that had been recorded. In Israel there were 800,000 soldiers ready to draw the sword, and the men of Judah numbered 500,000. But afterward David reproached himself for having numbered the people. And David said to Yahweh, I have sinned grievously in what I have done. Please, O Yahweh, remit the guilt of your servant, for I have acted foolishly. The prophet Gad came to David and told him. He asked, Shall a 7-year famine come upon you? Or shall you be in flight from your adversaries for 3 months? Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in the land? Now consider carefully what reply I shall take back to him who sent me. David said to Gad, Let us fall into the hands of Yahweh, for his compassion is great, and let me not fall into the hands of men. Yahweh sent a pestilence upon Israel from morning until the set time, and 70,000 of the people died. End quote. This episode is baffling. We have no idea why God is angry, and no idea why God has ordered a census as punishment. Why is a census a punishment? And why is Joab horrified at the idea? The Israelites have counted their number many times before, in the book of Exodus and the book of, Numbers. The story does not explain why David decides he has sinned for following God's own command. To add horror to bafflement, God kills 70,000 innocent Israelites because David has obeyed God's own directive. It's also worth pointing out that David was given a multiple-choice selection about Israel's punishment. Option B was that David the man would be on the lam for 3 months. He chose option A, a mass devastation of his own people. The biography of David is not the story of a king concerned for the welfare of his people. It is the story of a king who privileges his own life above all the nation. Centuries after the author of Samuel wrote, the Chronicler was also deeply troubled. He rewrote the story. Where Samuel places the census towards the end of David's reign, Chronicles places it at the beginning. Quote, 1 Chronicles 21:1. Satan arose against Israel and incited David to number Israel. David said to Joab, Go and count Israel from Beersheba to Dan, and bring me information as to their number. Joab answered, May Yahweh increase his people 100-fold. My lord king, are they not all subjects of my lord? Why should my lord require this? Why should it be a cause of guilt for Israel? However, the king's command to Joab remained firm. So Joab set out and traversed all Israel. Joab reported to David the number of the people that had been recorded. All Israel comprised 100,000 ready to draw the sword, while in Judah there were 470,000 men ready to draw the sword. God was displeased about this matter, and he struck Israel. Yahweh sent a pestilence upon Israel. God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. But as he was about to wreak destruction, God saw and renounced further punishment, and said to the destroying angel, "Enough, stay your hand." End quote. The chronicler could not countenance that God had forced the king to commit a sin. He attributed the census to Hasatan, a name meaning the adversary. This is the one and only time in the entire Old Testament that Satan appears as a supernatural entity with a will independent of God's. In the few other Old Testament references to Hasatan, the adversary is God's faithful servant. As a final note, take a look at those census numbers. The figures differ between Kings and Chronicles. Why, we don't know. In both cases, the figure for northern Israel is much larger than that for southern Judah. That certainly fits the archaeological evidence. The actual numbers do not. The best study about ancient demographics that I can find suggests that the people counted in David's census, men of military age, would have been about 20% of the whole. If we accept kings, then David's kingdom would have boasted 6.5 million souls. The widely accepted estimate of modern archaeologists is more like 75,000, 100th of that. The last few months or years of David are told in the first 2 chapters of the Book of Kings and the final chapters of 1 Chronicles. I'll give you an overview of the Book of Kings when I get to Solomon. For now, let's follow David's decline. This is the final section of the court narrative or the succession history that began with 2 Samuel chapter 9. It's a crackerjack yarn. David the king is old and impotent. His eldest son, Amnon, had been murdered by Amnon's younger brother Absalom. Absalom, in turn, was murdered after a failed rebellion. That left Adonijah, as the heir apparent. Let's begin with the book of 1 Kings. Quote, 1 Kings 1:1. David was now old, advanced in years, and he never felt warm. His courtiers said to him, "Let a young virgin be sought for my lord the king, to wait upon your majesty and be his attendant. And let her lie in your bosom, and my lord the king will be warm." So they looked for a beautiful girl throughout the territory of Israel. They found Abishag and brought her to the king. She became the king's attendant and waited upon him. But the king was not intimate with her. Now Adonijah went about boasting, "I will be king." He provided himself with chariots and horses, and an escort of 50 outrunners. His father had never scolded him. Why did you do that? He was the one born after Absalom, and like him, was very handsome. End quote. David is now in terminal Hugh Hefner mode. The only way he can keep warm is to spend the night in bed with a virgin. No hot water bottles for David. I'm surprised that other old men don't adopt that practice. After all, it's in the Bible. In a display of stupidity that should have immediately disqualified him from the monarchy, David's son Adonijah proclaims his succession. Given that David had at least 17 other sons, that is a very, very unwise move. Adonijah is supported by David's long-serving field marshal Joab, and by one of the 2 high priests, Abiathar. Abiathar was the last survivor of the priestly house of Eli. Both had been with David for 30 years or more. Now enter Bathsheba and her son Solomon, Shlomo. The rabbis believed that he was 12 years old at this point, which seems rather young. The last we saw of Bathsheba was during the moral crisis of 2 Samuel chapter 11. David had sent her husband Uriah to his death, Polygamous monarchies produce many potential successors. On the death of the king, only one mother and one son will survive the bloody mayhem that follows a succession. Bathsheba is determined that those survivors will be her and her son Solomon. Quote, 1 Kings 1:15. So Bathsheba went to the king in his chamber. The king asked, "What troubles you?" She answered him, "My lord, you yourself swore to your maidservant by Yahweh your God, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit upon my throne. Yet now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, know nothing about it. He has prepared a sacrificial feast, and he's invited all the king's sons, and Abiathar the priest, and Joab, commander of the army. But he has not invited your servant Solomon. And so the eyes of all Israel are upon you, O Lord King, to tell them who shall succeed my lord the king on the throne. Otherwise, when my lord the king lies down with his fathers, my son Solomon and I will be regarded as traitors." Then the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan and General Benaiah went down with the Kerethites and the Pelethites. They had Solomon ride on King David's mule. The priest Zadok took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. They sounded the horn, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" All the people then marched up behind him, playing on flutes and making merry, till the earth was split open by the uproar. End quote. In this palace coup, Bathsheba has found important allies. The prophet Nathan is an unlikely friend, as it was he who berated David over the whole Bathsheba and Uriah affair. They are joined by the second high priest, Zadok, who appeared from nowhere in 1 Chronicles 15 and episode 1.34. The coup is complete when they are joined by Benaiah, commander of David's trusted praetorian guard, the Greek Kerethites and Philistine Pelethites. One group noticeably absent is the elders of the 12 tribes. Both the books of Kings and Chronicles emphasize that David was acclaimed as king by the tribal chiefs. In both books, Solomon is acclaimed by the people, but not by the elders. The motif of a younger son overturning the natural principle of primogeniture runs deep through the first books of the Bible. In the story of Jacob and Esau, a scheming mother convinces her elderly husband to favour a younger over an elder son. Joseph was triumphant over his elder brothers. Moses was younger than Aaron. David was the youngest in his own family. In the Shockan Bible, Everett Fox suggests that this was a reflection of the Hebrews' own consciousness of their nation as a newcomer among the ancient and great powers of the world. Mind you, in all this, David is lingering on his deathbed. Solomon is not actually king, more like a regent, and more like just the guy with the most support to be the next king. It has been a common practice for millennia for kings to appoint their successors while they still live. The story continues in 1 Kings chapter 2. Solomon is David's heir. David gives him some final advice. Quote, 1 Kings 2:1. When David's life was drawing to a close, he instructed his son Solomon as follows: "Keep the charge of Yahweh your God, walking in his ways and following his laws, his commandments, his rules, in order that you may succeed in whatever you undertake and wherever you turn. You know what Joab did to me, and what he did to the 2 commanders of Israel's forces, Abner and Amasa. He killed them, shedding blood of war in peacetime, staining the girdle of his loins and the sandals of his feet with blood of war. So act in accordance with your wisdom, and see that his white hair does not go down to Sheol in peace. You must also deal with Shimei. He insulted me outrageously when I was on my way to Mahanaim. But he came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by Yahweh, I will not put you to the sword. So do not let him go unpunished, for you are a wise man, and you will know how to deal with him and send his grey hair down to Sheol in blood." End quote. David instructs Solomon to kill David's devoted commander-in-chief for crimes that David was only too happy for Joab to commit. He also settles an old score against Shimei of Saul's tribe of Benjamin, the man who had abused him while he was fleeing Absalom's rebellion. At the time, David bore Shimei's abuse in good grace, swearing not to punish him. Now he exploits a legal loophole. He will have Solomon kill Shimei. As usual, David's enemies will die by another's hand, while he himself is unsullied. The account of David's death is terse. Quote, 1 Kings 2:10. So David slept with his fathers, and he was buried in the city of David. The length of David's reign over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron, and he reigned 33 years in Jerusalem. And Solomon sat upon the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. End quote. In the Old Testament, David is one of Israel's greatest champions, after Moses and Joshua. The Bible recounts that the nation bewailed the deaths of the earlier heroes. No one mourns the passing of David. The people are silent. David is also silent. Unlike Moses and Joshua, David makes no grand valedictory speech. He says nothing to his people. He only has words for his son Solomon. Chronicles, but not Kings, has 3 whole chapters where David charges Solomon to build the temple. At David's death, his son the braggart Adonijah is still alive, along with his supporters General Joab and the high priest Abiathar. Adonijah, lucky to survive so far, makes a perfect case for Darwinian evolution. He asks Solomon's mother Bathsheba if he can take David's recent bed warmer, the virgin Abishag, as a wife. Bathsheba must have thanked her lucky stars for Adonijah's suicidal request. Or maybe she just made the whole thing up. Here is the perfect reason to dispose of her son's rival. Quote, 1 Kings 2:9. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him about Adonijah. The king rose to greet her and bowed down to her. He sat on his throne, and he had a throne placed for the queen mother, and she sat on his right. She said, "I have one small request to make of you." He responded, "Ask, mother, I shall not refuse you." Then she said, "Let Abishag be given to your brother Adonijah as wife." The king replied to his mother, "Why request Abishag for Adonijah? Request the kingship for him. For he is my older brother, and the priest Abiathar and Joab are on his side." End quote. Solomon eliminates Adonijah and Joab and exiles the high priest Abiathar. This bloody and contested transition does not appear in Chronicles. In that book, Solomon is acclaimed by all, succeeding to the throne as smoothly as Joshua succeeded Moses. As a bonus, Zadok the Jerusalemite is entrenched as high priest. Before we move on to Solomon's reign, let's take a look at the book of Psalms. If people know anything about David, they know he killed Goliath, that he was king of Israel, and he wrote a lot of psalms. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls says that he wrote a whopping 3,600 of them. The Masoretic text contains 150 psalms, divided arbitrarily into 5 books, probably to imitate the 5 books of the Pentateuch. These are the psalms that you will find in Protestant Bibles. The Septuagint contains a further psalm, number 151. Psalm 151 is a rather sweet little thing, where David thanks God for letting him behead Goliath, even though he was the youngest son of his father. You can find it in Orthodox and Armenian Bibles. In older Catholic Bibles based on the Latin Vulgate, it is found as an appendix. My contemporary Catholic New American Bible omits it. For many years, it was thought to be a late Greek composition, nothing to do with Hebrews. Its present in the Dead Sea Scrolls show it is indeed a Hebrew original. Through whatever accident of fate, it just never made it into the Tanakh. The Peshitta includes 2 more psalms. As I discussed way back in episode 1.3, this is the Syriac language version of the Bible, used by the 85 million members of the Oriental Orthodox churches. At 30,000 Hebrew words, the book of Psalms is one of the longest in the Bible. In Hebrew, it is known as the Book of Praises. It is the first book in the third and final section of the Hebrew Bible, the Writings. The Writings is a motley collection of works, including books such as Daniel, Chronicles, Proverbs, and Lamentations. One Dead Sea Scroll refers to the books of Moses and the prophets and David. The books of Moses are the first division of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets the second. The reference to David is usually taken to be a synonym for Psalms. That would suggest that Psalms was the first book to be recognised as part of the third division of the Tanakh, the Writings. Psalms are found in many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, almost 16% of all the biblical manuscripts found. The best guess for the dating of these particular scrolls is the time of Herod, the 1st century BC. Psalms 1 to 89 are pretty much the same as we have. From Psalm 90 on, there are radical differences in arrangement. None of the Psalm scrolls found at Qumran has our arrangement. There are also 9 psalms completely unknown to any biblical tradition. So while individual psalms are common in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls provide no idea of a coherent and codified single book of psalms. Half of the psalms contain a superscription referring to David. That superscription is usually translated as of David, but it could also be read as for David, or concerning David, or in honour of David. Traditionally, all 73 of these were taken as written by the great king. Even that association might be quite late. Kings has little to say about David as a musician. Chronicles is keen to discuss the fact. Everyone agrees that the Book of Kings was formed from materials centuries before the Chronicler wrote in the late Persian period. The idea that all of the Psalms were by David only arose in rabbinic literature during Roman times. Linguistically, none of the Psalms can be dated to the Old Hebrew of David's time, but of course they could have been reworked many times over the centuries. Apart from that, we have only vague ideas when they were written. The consensus is that they were gradually assembled through the ages by the guilds of singers and musicians that the Book of Chronicles tells us that David established. We can make some guesses, but they are only guesses. The first 2 psalms seem to be the last added, introducing the whole collection. Psalms 3 to 41 use Yahweh as the name of God, and almost all are ascribed to David. The God of Psalms 42 to 83 is called El. It would make sense to ascribe the former to the J source and the latter to the E source. So one idea is that the J Psalms are the oldest, to which were added the E Psalms. Where the others come from is anyone's idea. Almost all scholars agree that the Psalms were part of the liturgy of the Second Temple in the centuries after the return from Babylon. Most are dubious that they were part of the liturgy of the First Temple, from Solomon to the exile. In the next episode of The History in the Bible, we finish our survey of the Psalms, delving into their ancient Canaanite polytheism. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.